Good afternoon. I'm going to give a moment or so for some more folks to get themselves connected, but I know that a lot of people who sign up for our webinars take advantage of the ability to watch the recording later, since we do these during, generally always during the business day. So I do appreciate those of you who are here live and definitely appreciate those watching our webinar later on. If you're not aware, we also generally will post our webinars on our Goal Line YouTube channel. So if you check us out on YouTube, you'll see all of our, almost all of our previously aired webinars live that were live up as recordings on YouTube. So take advantage of that. A little bit of housekeeping as we get started as well. You'll notice that you don't have options to speak during the webinar, but there is a chat. So if you do have any questions as we go along, feel free to throw your questions and comments into the chat. I will take a look at that as we go through, and I'll either answer right away or come back to it or mention that we might come across that in another part of the webinar as we go along. Today's webinar is about preparing for spring sports. So really just preparing your season and preparing your site in general for use. For those that are doing spring sports, a lot of times your sport might start in March or April, but you're probably getting things ready in January or February. Things like registration tends to start a couple of months ahead of whatever your program start date is going to be. So we're going to take a look at the different things to do to get ready for a new season. All of this is going to be applicable if it's your first season with Goal Line, but there may be some things that you just do in a slightly different order if it's your first time using Goal Line. So we're going to go through a little bit of a checklist of what to look at and what to look into as you're preparing your new season, just to make sure that everything is all set up and in the best shape to go forward. We'll look at how you actually create a season, what kind of naming conventions and date ranges to use, how you might deal with when you have multiple seasons that depending on whether or not they overlap or not, you might need to handle a little bit differently. We'll look at what schedule placeholders need to be added so that you can get started with managing things like the rosters in the teams and things like that, and getting practice schedules up ahead of game schedules. And then we'll take a brief look at preparing a registration form. We're mostly going to look at how we're going to copy forward a previous registration form, but everything that we'll take a look at will certainly be applicable if you were starting that from scratch. So without further ado, you are seeing my screen here. We're looking at the admin control panel of my Goal Line demo site. The first thing I want to do is take a look at some of the things to think about before I bother creating my season. One thing I want to do is I want to make sure that all of the divisions and teams that I need are already in the system. Now, if you're a league or a tournament, you don't have to worry about the teams just yet. But if you're a club where you have your own rep teams or association teams, or if you're a club that has your own house leagues, there's some things that you want to take a look at. So the first thing that I want to do is check out my teams list. Now, I personally see both a league drop down and a team drop down. Not all administrators are going to see that option. You may only see one or the other. Nothing wrong with that. But once you, say, for example, select a league, you will now see the team drop down next to it with the teams that belong to the league that you happen to have checked into. Whenever I need to get back to my master menu, clicking on the Goal Line logo up at the top, that's going to take you back to that master menu if you're wondering how I get back here each and every time. So the first thing I'll do is look at my teams list. So I have some rep teams and they're grouped into some different categories. I have some U14, some 15, a soccer, a new menu, a mosquito. And then this one here where it's not in a menu group, that just means that it's not currently being displayed on the public side of the site. Where I go to manage these specific teams when it comes to just the teams themselves is going to be in the schedule section using manage association teams. So I'm going to want to make sure that all the teams that I'm using this season are going to be in there. And it's also where I can go to check out whether or not they're showing on the public side of the site. So I'm going to click manage association teams. Over here, I'm going to see that menu grouping. This is how we determine where those teams show up when we open it up in either the admin control panel menu or when the public is looking for their team in the list of teams or divisions that you have on the public side. You can create and manipulate these menu groups to call them whatever you want. This one is called U14 Rep, but maybe I just want it to be called U14 instead. So I can just easily update the menu grouping label for that and change the name of it. You'll also notice that there's a show and a hide button for those, or sorry, a restore to menu and a hide button that you can click. So if these teams are all of my winter teams, and as I'm preparing for spring, I don't want them to show up in the menu anymore because I just want it to be a complete flip of my winter teams versus my spring and summer teams. I can use the hide button here. Hiding the team doesn't delete them. It doesn't change your ability to manage them. If you're still using them, for example, for referee assigning, you can still do that. Hidden teams are still easily managed in the same exact way as every other team. They're just not in the menu on the public side. So if I go over to the public side of my site, which I can do by clicking go to site right here, and I look at my teams drop down, I don't see that U9 team in here because it's not set to show in my public facing menu. So once I have all the teams in the groupings that they want, I might need to consider as well, let's say my organization is growing or there's a specific age group that I don't know if you refer to it the same, but I often refer to it as there's sometimes big bubbles of age groups where there's a lot more kids in a certain age group than in the one ahead of it or the one coming behind it. So if we look over here, I have 3 U14 teams. I have 3 U15 teams. Maybe this year we don't have 3 U15 boys teams. Maybe we only have 2. So I might want to take this team 3 and just hide them from my menu because they're not going to be participating in my next season. I don't have enough players at this age group for this coming season to do that. The opposite may also be true. If you're really lucky and your sport is is growing, you may find that this year you do need that 3rd team. If it's already here, you can easily just restore that to the menu. It will either go back to where it was or it will put itself in a new menu group and you can just manipulate it from there. But let's say for U13 girls soccer, we're actually going to have 2 teams this year, not just 1 team. So I can add another team that's going to be playing in the same division as my existing U13 girls tier 1 team that's already here. The way I'm going to add that team is very important that I select the appropriate option over here. So first I'll put in the name of the team. So U13 girls tier 1, and this will be team, we'll say Smith for now, or north or south, or team 1, team 2, whatever works for you. The most important thing is if I know that this team is going to be playing in the same division as the other team that I have set up here, meaning there's chances where they're going to play against each other. They're all going to play against the same group of opposing teams, but they're also occasionally going to play each other as part of their regular league play. I need to make sure that I tell the goal line platform that they do play each other so that I can schedule that game with both of those teams involved and not end up with a schedule conflict. That way it'll show up properly on both of their schedules so that if I'm subscribed to team 2 schedule or team Smith's schedule, I'm going to get the game on my schedule and there won't be any issues with that. The goal line platform does do a lot of really robust conflict checking. And one thing that you'll find is if I just went and added my new team as an opposing team for the other one, it's going to be seen as a visiting team as if we don't really own that team. So this is a really important setting to make sure that you're setting up your teams appropriately to play against each other. I'm also going to show you what to do if you missed that step. So we will be able to fix that issue if you didn't set that up correctly from the start. So it's not the end of the world, but as long as you haven't added any games or practices, super easy to make that change. You'll also notice that as soon as I made that selection, it automatically completed for me the age, skill, and gender and the sport for that team. Now, the sport here is because my demo site is multi-sport. If you're not multi-sport, then you just don't have this option here at all. It just knows what sport you are. Goal line sites can either be a specific sport that we know right from the get-go. So everything just uses the sport terminology for that, or it could be multi-sport, in which case every team and league that gets added has its own specific sport designation so that we provide the right terminology in those league or team control panels. The menu placement doesn't automatically set itself to be the same menu grouping. So it'll default to new menu group, but I can also choose from any of the existing menu groups. So I want to put this one in the same soccer group as my other team, and I'm going to click to create the team. All right, so I've done that. Now I can go back into create to my teams here, and we can see that now I have the two teams showing up over here. I'm going to edit this Velutini's new team just to see what sport that is, and I'm going to make it soccer just for simplicity here. These are in alphabetical order. I remember the alphabet, I think. There we go. So I'm going to change that, and I'm going to put them into the soccer group as well. So I'm going to edit that team. So now that I've done that, I've manipulated a little bit of what teams are showing up. So we were able to hide a team, bring a team back into the menu, add a new team, and then change a team's menu group. You can do this to make sure that your menu groupings that are going to be displayed are exactly as you want to see them. And then you can just hide anything that you're not using for that current season. You don't have to hide things. If you use your menu groupings appropriately, you can say, this is the U15 winter group, and then have another group for the U15 summer group if you're not using the same teams for both of those consecutive seasons. Very, very similarly, we're going to do the same thing with leagues. So I'm going to go right into manage leagues. This is going to look almost identical to what we were just doing, but this is adding a division where you're managing the division here. A very, very important distinction to make is between association teams and leagues. Association teams, those are teams that you have where you build that team. You're the one that makes the coaches and the rosters. You do the tryouts. And then that team participates in a league where the standings are actually managed by someone else. That's when you have an association team. If you are the one managing the standings, then you're going to add that as a league. We use the word league here, but division or category, age group might be appropriate for the terminology you're used to using. So here we have Novice AAA. This is my league. I manage this. The standings exist with me, and all of the teams that participate are teams that belong to the associations around me, or maybe it's a house league where we just have lots of kids. I guess AAA is not a great example of house leagues, but we do have some examples of house leagues in here. So you can have all kinds of your menu groupings here for leagues. Similarly to our association teams, I select a sport because I am multi-sport, but the menu placement, age, skill, and gender characteristics, you're able to make those selections here. And then after you've created this league, the teams don't need to be added right away. The teams that are actually going to participate don't need to be added right away because there's a couple of different things you might be doing. One, you might be using the same teams every year, so the teams are already there from last year, or you're just going to add them manually. Another option is you might be using team registration. Tournaments often use team registration. So until teams start registering, the league is there. It's got its season. It's got a placeholder schedule ready to go, and now you're just accepting teams into the league from their registration forms. The league itself just needs to be a nice, easy league name. So generally it's going to be your age, your skill, and potentially the gender. So this is Novice AAA. I'm going to update this now because in North America and Canada specifically, and I think it's happening in the US as well, we're not using the Atom, Pee-wee, Bantam, Midget terminology anymore. So the novice age group, I think novice age group is U9. So U9 AAA. This happens to be boys. I don't need to use the word boys in here, but let's say I have potential to have a girls Novice AAA. I might want to differentiate by keeping the word boys in the league name here. So I'm just going to make that quick edit, and we'll edit that league. Similar to the teams, you can hide or show different leagues, and you can just delete leagues if you need to. You'll notice that if there are still remaining schedules, you can't hide things just yet because those schedules need to still be accessible on the public side of the site. If they were already hidden, you can still add schedules and they can stay hidden, but just keep that in mind. So here we have our managed league. So we've done that. We've checked on our teams. We've got all our teams that we need. We have our leagues. And now we want to make sure that our season is ready and that we can go ahead and add a placeholder schedule. The next thing we'll look at is how we can do that managed seasons. And we'll talk about a few other things before we get into registration here. So when I'm looking at the create seasons option, when you have history with Goalline, you are going to see those historical seasons populating to the right of your screen. These can be edited if needed, but generally speaking, they're just going to gray themselves out when they're no longer active and no longer current. As you roll your season forward, this automatically will become inactive and kind of grayed out like this, but you can manually go back in and change things around so that it is editable and shown in the control panel, but it's still not the active season. So very important that your current season is going to be the active season. When you do this season rollover process, I'm just going to click back to get back to that generic screen here. When you do your process, we're going to assume that whatever season you're creating here is going to become the active season, and that the previous season is going to gray itself out and no longer be active or shown in the control panel. But as you can see, you can definitely still be able to see those previous seasons. The season name is something that you do want to be really short and simple with. Using spring sports as our example today, it may be appropriate for you to use a season name like 2023 spring. And that's going to depend on how your other seasons during the year are labeled. If you are only a spring or summer organization, you might not even need to use the word spring or summer. You can just say 2022 or 2023, I guess it is now. I'm going to have to get used to that. So 2023 could be our season. If you're like a hockey organization, for example, often wants their season to be spanning that the calendar year. So you might want 2023-24. But if you're just going to be operating in the spring and summer, you're going to be all encompassing in the 2023 year. So that can be as simple as it is. You don't need anything else for that season. I really also repeat every time I talk about this that you do not need to use the word season in your season name. So I don't want to call this 2023 season, because the word season is going to put itself where it needs to go when we need to see it later. The other thing is that often does create a little bit of confusion with the schedule names. So your schedule name that's going to go in here is going to be, one of them will be at least regular season. So with league play, you typically have maybe a preseason, a regular season, and a playoff schedule. Those all are schedules that exist within the season that we're going to call 2023. Now, my season is current, so I'm not going to actually finish this today, but I do want to talk about the date range that you're selecting. The date range should start on or before today's date, whatever date that is that you're doing this. And it should go until, as I just mentioned, all your schedules that belong in that season are over. So if our season is going to actually get started March 10th, I still want my season date range to start today so that I don't have any annoying pop-ups that are going to tell me that my season's not current when I'm going in and trying to manage things, and when I'm dealing with building rosters and maybe adding practice schedules, because we might start practicing before the season start date. So when it comes to the season date range, you want to make sure that it includes today's date or earlier, and all the way through to the day after everything is absolutely 100% finalized for that competitive season. When you're setting that date range, you also need to make sure that it doesn't overlap with the season that's already applicable. So here, for example, my Winnipeg men's volleyball league, we've got a season on here now. Everybody's in my 2022-23 season, and we go August 1st to July 31st. If I try to create a season that starts today and I try to apply that to my volleyball league, there's already a season. So that's going to be a conflict, and I can't do that. So what I'm going to need to do is make sure that my season that I start ends after this one ends, or I can always adjust the season date range for the season that's there. If that doesn't make sense, because this season really does go until the end of July, then what you need to do is actually create a second league to represent the different season version of this league. So my Winnipeg men's volleyball league, if that winter season overlaps 100% with our spring and summer season, then I need to have a winter league and a summer league so that they can be independent and work beside each other and not be in conflict with each other. So making sure that your season date ranges are not going to overlap. If they do overlap and they really have to overlap, then what you need to have is a second set of teams or leagues represented for that season. So soccer is a great example, where soccer is traditionally a sport that starts in the spring and it's an outdoor summer sport. But with indoor soccer being so popular, the indoor and outdoor seasons are starting to very, very frequently overlap each other. You may still be participating in provincials and nationals in September, October, November, whereas your indoor season probably started right at the beginning of October. So you're going to want to have yourself distinct sets of divisions and leagues that represent your spring versus your winter or summer and fall types of divisions. So when your overlap is legit and you really can't just change the date range to accommodate it, you want to make sure that you create a second league using that manage leagues function that we were looking at previously. So now that we've got that out of the way, we'll select the appropriate date range. And generally, I always recommend that you check all if that makes sense for you. If you run nothing but leagues, you can probably check all and do this all at the same time. If you have a mixture of leagues and rep teams, then you may want to do what I'll do here is like check all except for our rep team ones. These are all rep team divisions, and I know this because of the little info bubble that shows up. This is a league name that has my rep team in it. When we look at our U15 boys tier 1, you can see there that now it has those 3 teams in it. Same thing with my U9 and my U7s and whatnot. So we're going to see all of those teams in there. There's our Smith team along with the team 1 and team 2. So when you're looking at your season, you may want to do it in a couple of iterations. So you do one behavior for one set where that's applicable, and then a different behavior for the other. The date range and the name of your season generally doesn't need to be any different. You would just put in exactly the same details here. You would just be checking the other set when you go and do it the second time around. There's another really big reason why you might treat these a little bit differently, and that is where we get into these optional settings below. For leagues that use team registration, where teams are required to register with you every year, and for tournaments, again, where team registration is assumed, you want to select the box here that says to remove the previous active season's teams from the system. This does not remove them from the public side, so I can always still go back and look at those historical seasons and see who was in first place and look at game results and player stats from those historical seasons. But what it does is clears out the league so that when I go and visit my U13 AAA league after I've done this, it's going to have the schedule that I add, but it's not going to have any teams in it until the teams get added through either registration or I manually create those teams. If you don't use team registration and you have almost or essentially the same teams every single season, you can leave that blank. And what will happen is it will just keep the same teams in the system. That being said, keeping the same teams in the system by default is going to release all the rosters because we're going to assume that U13 AAA players who are on the team now are not necessarily going to be U13 AAA players in the next season. Some of them are going to be U15 players. Some of them are going to try out and maybe not make the AAA team again. So releasing the rosters is something that will happen automatically unless you check the box here that says to keep those team rosters active into the new season. I usually use the example of adult organizations here to really exemplify that. So adult organizations will typically have a roster that's going to be identical from one year to the next with a couple of changes. Whereas youth organizations are kind of the opposite. You may have a couple of kids who are still on the team next year, but for the most part, you're looking at an entirely new group of kids based on their age, based on what they tried out for, what teams they made when they tried out, etc. So keep in mind that there are these 2 optional settings. Without selecting the optional settings at all, remember that all the rosters for all of these teams will be empty and all of the teams will stay exactly where they are. If you check either of these, you're going to be manipulating those options. Usually with rep teams that are youth, you're going to want to allow the default behavior without clicking any of these options. With adult organizations or leagues where you're doing registration, you might want to make different choices there. If you use team registration, you definitely want to remove the previous active seasons teams from the system. But you might only want to do that for the leagues that you use registration for, not for the teams that you have players registering for. So we'll look at those 2 options there. And then what's the last thing I want to mention about your season? Yeah, so managing your season, the date range, the name, the optional options that you have there, those are the most important settings, and that it starts on or before today. If it can't start on or before today, that's no problem, but you will find that there's going to be a pop-up when you go to certain menus that says that there's a season, but it's not current. And that's fine. You can always just close those pop-ups. They don't prevent you from really managing things, but it can get a little annoying to have those pop-ups all the time. So that is managing your season to give your season the appropriate name and date range and make sure that the behavior is appropriate. As soon as you've done managed seasons, I always recommend that the very next thing you do is go in and manage your schedule. I often get asked the question, and our support team fields this question a lot too. I don't have a schedule yet. Why do I have to add one? Goal line requires an active season and an active schedule in order to assume that the league or team you're dealing with is actually going to be used. If it doesn't have an active season or schedule, we assume you're not using it right now, and you will be unable to do certain things like assigning players and coaches to that team to build the roster. You're also unable to add practices for that team. You wouldn't be able to form a team to have like team attendance set up and things like that. So without having the schedule placeholder ready to go so that when you're ready to add games, you have a place to put them, the system's going to consider that your teams are not going to be used. The very first setting that you see here, and now if you only have association teams, you don't see this setting here at all because all of your schedules are going to be considered regular standing style schedules. But if you do run leagues and divisions or tournaments, you're going to find that you have to choose between a standing style and a playoff style schedule. The standing style schedule is the appropriate schedule option for things like a preseason, a tiering round, a regular season, and an exhibition style schedule or a round robin schedule as part of a tournament. The playoff and bracket style is going to be appropriate for the elimination style tournament portion of your playoffs, or if you're doing a tournament and you have playoffs following a round robin, that's when you're going to select that. So if you're running a tournament, you will, well, even a league, you almost always need both a regular season schedule or a round robin schedule and a playoffs or finals schedule so that the standings from your regular or round robin schedule are able to impact the seeding for the playoff bracket style schedule. So with your regular season schedule, that's the one you should create first. Regular season is almost always needed by every organization. And so that's the one I always recommend creating first. If you also have things like tiering, balancing, preseason and exhibition schedules, then you'll just keep repeating the create schedule process to create that type of schedule for your leagues and teams. Remembering that all of those types of schedules are standing style schedules. You can also start preparing your playoff schedule in advance too, so you can create that on the same day as you create your other regular season schedules. The date range for your schedules is going to come into play there just to make sure that you don't have games that overlap from playoffs to regular season and so on. Again, the check all button is there for you, but you don't have to check all. You can check some, but not all. And there's a good reason for doing that we'll get to here shortly. When it comes to the details, you want to make sure that the first detail that says, is this the active schedule, is set to yes. Because as I said, all your leagues and teams have to have an active season and an active schedule in order to be considered active. So the active setting here is important for one of your schedules, and it should be the regular season schedule because that's the one, if I go and navigate to standings, that's what I'll see first. Whether or not you want to publish the schedule itself or publish that standings page is up to you. So you don't have to publish it right away. A lot of organizations will not publish the schedule right away and wait until you've had a chance to work out all the different scheduling kinks that might be going on in your area. I know scheduling is not an easy task. So a lot of times people like to keep that schedule not published until you're sure that it's a good schedule and that you're able to proceed with it once all your divisions are done. So you can always edit this setting later to publish it down the road. But generally speaking, we'll see the active yes, published yes, publish the standings yes. The reason that you may do some of these things in an iteration, we'll say, we'll do this for this, this, and this, but not for those ones, is maybe you have different rules. There's a lot of organizations, I'm trying to think of some specific examples here, but I know that there's a lot of leagues where you're not tracking scores, you're not actually keeping standings at all. So if I was doing this for, let's say, my U11C boys soccer teams for the summer, we don't track scores and standings at that level. So yes, I want it to be active. Yes, I want it to be published, but no, I don't want to see any standings because we're not tracking standings. There's not going to be any playoffs. It's just sort of a house league for fun. So recreational, maybe you don't need standings at all. So you can maybe do a set of a group of divisions that have this type of setting, and then repeat the process to make sure that everybody gets the appropriate settings. All kinds of other details in here to go through. And there's some great scheduling webinars that we've done in the past that you can get a really good deep dive into what each and every one of these different settings means on the schedule. The most important thing is going to be the schedule name, the active setting and published setting being yes, whether or not you're tracking individual stats. So are you tracking just the score, or are you actually tracking who scored? Are you tracking cards? Are you tracking penalties? Things like that. So there's some settings there. Your point values for wins, losses, and ties. If you're doing shootouts and overtime, your durations and things. These are all really important settings to have from the get-go. So we have here a number of periods in a regulation game. So my scheduled default here is referring to hockey. So there are 3 periods, but they're not 0 minutes, they're 10 minutes long. If I am doing overtime, we'll say we're going to do 1 overtime period. If this is soccer, you're going to have, your 2 15s if you're doing the FIFA extra time rules and that kind of thing. So whatever your extra time or overtime is, you're going to put in those settings here. I'm just going to leave those as zeros. And then the last setting here that's really important before we get to the date range is your allotted venue time. This is another reason why you may do an iteration of, let's apply this set of schedules, like this schedule, to all of these groups, but then maybe not to this other group, is the duration of the game. And using soccer again as that example, U12 house league boys in my area, we're only doing 25-minute halves. We only get our venue for 60 minutes. But if we were doing an under 18 game, of course, those are 45-minute halves, and we need a lot more than 60 minutes. So the venue time there is probably going to be at least 90 minutes, ideally probably 105 minutes. So you have that 15-minute buffer for your halftime and whatnot. So your allotted venue time might be categorically different for a grouping than it is for another grouping. So keep that in mind just to make it so that those schedule details are as accurate as possible for all of your divisions right from the beginning, especially if you're using the goal line system to assign your officials. It's really important to have your allotted venue time be accurate because if we assumed that 60 minutes applies to all of them and then you assign a referee to a 6 o'clock soccer game, they're going to look like they're available at 7 o'clock, where we know that they're not. They're not going to be available till 7:45 or 8 o'clock, depending on the venue time allotment for each and every one of those games. So keep that in mind. Your effective start and end date of the schedule is also a really important one. This is one where it doesn't need to start today. I do usually recommend that you start on or before the current date when you're doing this work, just to, again, avoid any kind of pop-ups and make it so that you don't have any issues with being able to go in and schedule your games. Your regular season and exhibition schedules, often you're going to use a date range that's almost identical to your season's date range. But for security reasons, you may want to make sure that they end before the end of your season so that they end in time for your playoffs to populate with the appropriate teams based on how you configured your playoff schedule. So if your playoffs begin on April 1st, you might need to make sure that no games happen after March 31st. So you might want to make sure, even if your season date range goes for a while longer, you might want to end your schedule date range on March 31st so that you can't accidentally schedule games outside of the range where they needed to be scheduled at. If you made a lot of changes that are going to apply most of the time when you're creating schedules. If you haven't already, you can check the box that says to make this the default. The only thing that you have to do again when you make your new default is you have to enter your schedule date range and the name of your schedule. So keeping that in mind, that just makes it easier to not have to make a whole lot of changes to everything every time you go and create a schedule. So when you create your schedule, you're going to see it right away. And you'll see over here on the right that I can see my 2023 season has a regular season schedule. In my women's league, there's lots of games on it. In my men's volleyball league, no games. No, I don't want to do that. I didn't mean to click a delete button. So your schedule, your season is going to be here along with the schedule name for any schedules that exist. I'm not sure if I have any more here. So I've got a showcase schedule down here along with a regular season schedule. So one thing I don't have, actually, let's do that. I don't have a playoff schedule. So I'm going to put in a playoffs schedule. I'm just going to call it playoffs. I'm going to make it a playoff bracket style schedule. And I do want to give that to everyone so that they have a place to put those. So yeah, I don't want it to be the active schedule yet because it's not going to be used just yet. My regular season schedule is still my active schedule. I'm going to start that today and I'm going to go until July 31st. And lots of weird details on this, but that's all right. It's a demo site. So I'm going to create my schedule here now. So now that I've created my placeholder schedule, so I double checked on all my teams for my rep teams. I looked at all the leagues that I have. I manipulated what I need there. Went ahead and made sure that my season was good, added my placeholder schedule so that whenever we're ready to start adding games, we can do that. Couple other little things to check into is, do I have all my venues in the system? This is something on my little season rollover checklist is if you are lucky enough to have a new venue in your area, make sure that you've gone in and added that to your list of venues so that if you're importing a schedule file or trying to add a game manually, that venue is already listed in the system. My demo site is using a feature called regions. So you're going to see that my venues are grouped into different regions. But generally speaking, you just want to make sure that they're all listed in here. Several years ago here in the Halifax area of Nova Scotia, we got a couple of new 4-pad arenas, like hockey rinks with 4 ice surfaces in them. So that was kind of nice because we had to go through and add new venues because there's more ice surfaces for folks to use. So you want to make sure that any new venues in your area or that your teams are going to be using, even if it's an away venue, you want to make sure that you have those listed in your settings for add, edit, delete venues. It's as easy as just giving it a title and hitting quick add, or you can go over to the left-hand side and add it right away with all of its details to make sure that their address information and potentially Google Map directions and stuff is automatically included along with the venue being added. So just double check that you've got all of your venues. Might be in some cases too that you just need to edit the names of some of those venues. Another example right here from that same 4-pad rink example. When it first opened up, it was sponsored and it was called the BMO Center. It's no longer sponsored, so it's not called the BMO Center anymore. So it's really important to make sure that you're making those updates so that people know what venue you're talking about. If I called it the BMO Center and I meant the Bedford 4-pad, I don't want people going to the wrong place because I had the wrong name in my system. So keep that in mind as well. Another famous one from here in Halifax, I still call it the Metro Center, but it's called the Scotiabank Center. So little things like that, just double check that your venue listing is accurate and that all the venues you need are in there. I'm now going to hop in and look at one of my rep teams and just talk a little bit about, let's look at Velutini's new team over here. I'm going to talk a little bit about how I make sure that I have teams to play against. So this is a newer team in the system. And if I just go to add, edit, delete games here, I can try to create a game, but we'll see who can I play against. So I've got some teams in here that I can play against. So my team has to be one of the teams that I select, and then any of the other teams I would select from this list over here. So I've got the teams to set up here, and then here's that list of venues that I'm choosing from to make sure that I'm selecting the appropriate venue. Create that game. I can manipulate the allotted venue time in minutes on a game by game basis, and in a schedule upload, you can deal with that as well. But this is going to be taking the schedule default, which before we made some changes, there was 75 minutes per game. So we'll create our game here. I just hit enter to save that, but there is a save button down at the bottom. I just wanted to create it nice and quick. And you'll notice here that because I'm in a rep team, admin control panel, I have to use this my rep team in a game. I can't come in here and say orange is going to play blue, because neither one of those teams technically are my teams. Those are just teams that we play against when my teams are playing in their regular schedule. The way that I make sure that all those teams are in there is I'm going to go to that team admin section, and I'm going to go to add, edit, delete teams right over here. So add, edit, delete teams. Here are the opposing teams. Here's my association team. So I can clearly see that they're differentiated. These are just our opposing teams. They're just visitors. Or maybe we're going to play and they'll be the home team, we'll be the visiting team when we go to play the blue team. When you have to add new teams here, you just put in however many you need to add, hit submit, and then give them a name. You can also give them a jersey color. That's entirely optional. When it comes to leagues, I know I mentioned this already, that registration is one of the most popular ways to get teams into leagues. But if you're not using team registration, or you're just not dealing with new teams every year, you can go into the league control panel and you'll find manage teams here. So this is going to show me all the teams that exist in this division, and I can edit them. I am able to delete the teams. I can click delete team and delete multiple teams over here. And I can also add teams in the same exact way as we were just looking at for the opposing teams over there. So I can add teams manually, or I can see the teams that are here. When I look over here, I generally see a small snapshot of things like the coaches and players assigned to the team and that kind of thing. And I can also link directly to their team roster. I can't do that from the team control panel, because those teams, I don't have the rosters for those visiting teams. I only have a roster for my own team, and there's a different way to get to that roster. So that's how we make sure that all the teams are there for us to create our schedule with. The next thing I'll look at is just to show you a little bit about the playoff schedule tools, because this might be important for you to set up correctly from the beginning. I want to edit the details of this. So this is my playoff schedule. It's set to no for being active because I'm not using it yet. We're still in the regular season. But there are some things that, because this is a playoff schedule, we have some additional options down here that I want to point out. The playoff type by default is going to say series, but if you want it to look like a bracket with the trees, you want to select that option, and I'll show you what that what the difference is going to be. I don't want that. I want, what do I want? Let me see here. Go to my league standings, and we'll look at last year's playoffs, or no, yeah, last year's playoffs. So this playoffs is set up as a tree, not a series. And so if you want it to look like one of these, where you have your actual playoff bracket trees showing up on the standings, then you want to select that it's a tree. The series option functions similarly, so you're still able to accomplish the same kind of elimination rounds and multiple rounds of, like if Lightning versus Blizzard, if they need to do a best 2 out of 3, you can still do all of that with the series style, but you can see it's just laid out very, very differently. It's going to start with round 1, series A, and go all the way down, move into, round 2, A and B, round 3, and so on. Depending on the number of teams, you may have a lot of rounds, you might have a lot of series. So that's kind of the difference in what they look like on the public side. A lot of times folks want the tree option, so I'm going to select the tree option. The other thing that's really important is to select, of course, the feeding schedule. So the feeding schedule is going to give you an option to use any standing style schedule that's already in this season for this league, or you can manually seed. Manual seeding lets you go and just select what teams are going to be seeded in what order for the purpose of the first round of your playoff schedule. If you have a tournament where you don't have a round robin, then you might want to either have no seeding or manual seeding, where you seed them based on some other information that you have, because you wouldn't have a round robin or regular season schedule to base it on as far as what their standings were. I'm going to pick my regular season schedule. So that way, when I go to set up my playoff series, I'm going to be able to say things like first place versus eighth place in my regular season schedule. I could set that up today, even though it's not going to happen for months and months and months. And then as soon as all of my regular season schedule games are reported and the standings have been finalized, my playoff schedule is automatically going to populate with the teams based on the selections that I made. So that's what I'm going to select in there. And we'll save our changes over here. All right, so now we've got a playoff schedule that is ready to start managing, and I can do that in a couple of different ways. I can set up playoff trees right here at the bottom of my schedule details, but I'll show you again kind of how I got in there. So remember that I'm in a league menu. I went to schedules, and I clicked on the edit schedule details for my playoff schedule. I have edit schedule details, which let me change the details for the schedule that I happen to be grouped into. Notice how my regular season is the one here noted as active. And whenever I do click on the standings for any of my divisions, it's going to go to whichever one is set as the active schedule, even though there is a newer schedule on here called playoffs. That will automatically become active when all my regular season games are reported. So that is getting our schedule placeholders and everything ready to go into our leagues and our teams. And now we'll take a look at preparing registration forms. So I've mentioned team registration a couple of times, but when people think about registration, they're usually thinking about individual or player registration, players and coaches going and registering themselves as individuals, paying their individual fees, doing their consents and whatnot, providing you their information. So we'll take a brief look at team registration first, because I think that's a little easier to get through. So team registration forms, you're going to have a list of forms available in here, and you can edit them. You can also copy and archive. So editing the form, it's going to show me that 5-step process of how do I want this form to behave. And both our individual and team are in a 5-step process, in very, very similar processes here. The most important thing for your managing team forms is to make sure that you have the appropriate close date for your form. So the expiry date of the form, or if you're using priority registration, the close date used on your priority registration. You want to make sure that teams cannot register after a date that it doesn't make sense for them to register anymore. This season is going to start in March, so we really shouldn't be having registration go until June. We don't want new teams to register in June when the season's already halfway over at that point. So there's lots of things to go through in team registration. We have an entire webinar dedicated just to team registration, as well as entire webinars dedicated to individual registration. But what I do want to show in here is if you are just starting, you're going to just create your form from scratch. And then next season, you can use that form again by just clicking copy and archive. You'll have an option down here to either just make a copy or make a copy so that I have a new form and archive the old one, or I can just archive it. You can also permanently delete forms, which I only recommend doing if it was a test form. Sending forms to child registration sites, that's a feature that may or may not apply to your particular organization. You have to be part of a goal line network for that. So it doesn't apply to most, but if it's available, what it does is creates a copy of that form on all the child sites that are associated with you. So creating a copy of the form will give you a place to give it a new title. I always recommend putting a year in your form's title just to make it really easy and never have confusion. But that being said, some folks prefer, let's not have the year in the new form, but let's put the year in the old form. So if I want to say this was archived 2022 and my new one is just my new one, I can do it like that. So I can make it so that my new form will be called exactly the same thing, but my old form, when I go to do reporting on it, I'll be able to look at the archived 2022 form, just to make sure that everything is really nicely categorized into the various seasons that you've had over time. Now we'll move on to individual registration forms. It's exactly the same process as far as copying and archiving. So you're able to do that. What I find a lot of times people will do is copy their form and make a couple of copies for it so that you have a form for refs, a form for players, a form for coaches. Maybe for when it comes to players, you might want to have one that's a regular registration form and one that's a tryout form, or one that's maybe, for camps and clinics, or extra stuff, conditioning camps and things like that. So there's lots of different ways that you might want to have a lot of different forms that are available. But whichever form you are dealing with, you can still do this copy and archive, and it's exactly the same thing. So we're seeing that same exact option down here of copy and archive, just copy, or permanently delete. Once you've copied a form, whether it was a team form or an individual form, the next thing you want to do immediately is go through that form's 5 steps and look for any date sensitive information. So the closing date will automatically default to a year after the form was created, but you may have other things in here that need to be adjusted. If you have policy language or program date ranges and things like that, those might need to be adjusted. So everything looks good on my step 1. Step 2 is where I also have my programs listed, programs, products, and discount options. So the other thing to look through, of course, is to make sure that your programs have the correct prices. A lot of times we'll see a small increase in registration fees from one season to the next. And so you might want to make sure that you're adjusting the prices accordingly, because it will be an exact copy of last year's form. The other thing is the age restrictions. So age restrictions, this is obviously for coaches, so maybe you don't have an age restriction, but let's pretend this is U14. For whatever. So your age restriction here, the birth year range of from this to this would have been applicable to last year's U14. So I still want this to be U14, but that means I'm just going to have to advance the years on my age restrictions. So making sure that your age restrictions are appropriate, because it's an exact copy. A player who was U14 this year was not born in the same year as a player who was U14 last year, or even 2 years ago, and so on. So keep that in mind. Your date sensitive, your prices and your age restrictions on your programs, those are date sensitive. So make sure that you adjust those. If you have any date sensitive information called out directly in your policy section, make sure to include that as well. For example, refund policy deadlines. If you have a specific date set in your refund policy, you want to just make sure that you edit that particular policy and make sure that it's up to date for the next season. Payment information generally doesn't change, but if you have offline payment instructions, you might need to adjust those. Maybe you have a new treasurer this year compared to last year, or again, the deadline for payments and stuff might be a little bit different. And then your confirmation email message, your confirmation message subject is going to be a copy of last year. So you're going to want to make sure that you adjust this to say, hey, welcome to our 2023 season. But again, just making sure that you're going through and double checking on any date sensitive information that might be in your registration form. And then once you have all of that covered and you've made all your adjustments, you're ready to go ahead and try to publish that form. It will do a quick check on all the compliances that you need and make sure that everything is all good to go. If it's all good to go, you're going to be able to publish that form and show it in your menu or share the link out to whoever. If it's not good to go, it's going to pop up and tell you why it's not good to go. And then you just go make those adjustments. So that is how you're going to advance forward your player or coach or whatever registration forms. If you're just getting started, you're going to create a form by just giving it a new name. Tell us who's registering on this form. So is it an athlete or player? Is it a coach? Is it a ref? Is it a volunteer? And so on. And then you create that form. Then you're just creating that from scratch. So that is our how you prepare your registration forms. So preparing for a spring season, double check that you've got all your venues in the system, double check that you have all the teams and leagues that you need, double check that you have, that you know what season date range that you want to use, and make sure that your schedule placeholder gets in there right as soon as you finish doing that manage seasons function, and then prepare your registration forms per usual, and you are ready to go. I'm remembering now that at the beginning I said I was going to show you something fun and I forgot to show you. So I'm going to show you now. So if you were setting up your association teams and you forgot to say that they play against each other, there is a way to fix that. So we're going to go ahead and fix that. I'm going to go into just any of my division names here and see how. Okay, we have a pop-up because they exist, but they haven't actually been added to a schedule. That's because they're a brand new team and they didn't automatically get added to the schedule. So that's okay. I can click to edit the schedule details right from here in the pop-up, or I can navigate to that the same way as I did earlier by going here. Edit schedule details. When I scroll to the bottom, it shows me all the teams that are available to participate in this league. So I just need to go ahead and check that one off and let them participate in that. So we'll save that change. And now they're in the division. What I really need now is to get the Velutini's new team to show up in that list. Because if we look here, that Velutini's new team is not listed in here. And that's even though they're in the same menu group. It's because they weren't set up appropriately to play against each other. So when I go to the team admin section over here, I can click on the option that says move teams. I want to select the league that the team belongs to, which happens to be Amanda's League U14. And I'm going to click go. It's going to show me the teams that exist. And then it's going to show me, oh, you know what? I'm not going to be able to move it. I can't check this box, and there is an information bubble telling me why. There are games and practices scheduled into the future for this team. So in order to move them, I have to remove those games. And that's okay, because I probably just want to remove them anyway, because they probably weren't added in a way that's going to help me out. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to that team's control panel, and I'm going to go to add, edit, delete games. And I'm just going to delete the games. So I'm going to say search all games and schedule. Oh, is that not the team that I want? Let me see here. Schedule regular season. Oh, because I'm looking at the wrong team. That's what's going on there. So Velutini's new team. Add, edit, delete games. Velutini's new team. Oh, goodness. All right. I don't know where I put them. So I do have to delete those games in order to move that team. But if I can use a different example here for that. So let's just go ahead and we'll select our boys tier 1. And see how I can select these teams here. If I do have any games or practices in the future, you cannot move the team. You do have to move the schedules, like remove the schedule first and then add the schedule back in once they're added. But if I want to select this here, I can select that this U15 boys team is going to move to a different league. So we're going to move those over to this one and click move teams. It's going to ask if I'm sure. And then it's also going to, if I have created ads and news articles, it's going to bring those over with it to the new team as opposed to kind of ignoring them and having to create new ads for the new one. So I would confirm that if I want to make that change. So that's how we can move those teams if they weren't put in the right division to begin with. But you do want to get that taken care of as soon as possible in your season prep process so that you don't run into the issues that I just ran into there, where I have to go and kind of locate those practices and games and make sure that they're they're removed and that I don't add them first and whatnot. So so that is the thing that I meant to come back to earlier in the webinar after we were creating our association teams there. So a little bit of a checklist there to go over for your season rollover, all the different things to think about, the conventions for giving your season a name and a date range, what schedules are the best to add first there, and then how to go ahead and make sure that your registration forms are ready to go. Our YouTube channel is a great resource. I said at the top of the webinar here, but the resource is really good there because you'll be able to take a look at things like our scheduling webinars for, you know, how would I upload a schedule file or generate a schedule or add games, but also how would I prepare registration forms for teams or for individuals. So there's lots of good material you can take a look through and check out whatever webinar is most applicable to what you need for now. There's also some great resources on like running tournaments and things like that. So so check out the Goal Line YouTube channel for any previous webinars that go into that deeper dive on individual and team registration and into the scheduling tools, because this webinar today was a little bit more overview style and just making sure that you know what buckets of features to look at in what order so that you're on the right foot as your season gets started. So that is today's webinar. We'll have another one coming up in the next couple of weeks or so. We're likely going to be moving to monthly webinars as opposed to every 2 weeks, but we might keep them every 2 weeks for a little bit here. Be on the lookout for our Goal Line newsletters and any invitations to our next upcoming webinars. So thanks so much for attending, or if you're watching this later, thanks for sticking around, and have yourself a wonderful day.